Have you ever looked at your schedule and felt safe? A perfectly planned day, an 8 a.m. meeting, a 12 p.m. lunch with a partner, a 3 p.m. report deadline. Every single square on our calendar is a promise of control, proof that we are the masters of our own lives. We build fortresses out of appointments and goals, believing that nothing can intervene, nothing can break the orbit we have so carefully plotted. We all live like that. Safe, predictable. But life has a tragically ironic sense of humor. It often places the greatest turning points where we least expect them. Not in a luxurious boardroom, but on a windswept sidewalk. Not in a $1 million contract, but in an offer made by a child's voice. Today, I want to tell you such a story. A story of a man who built an empire on logic and control. A king reigning from his own glass tower, looking down on the city of Chicago and believing he had calculated every variable. Until one day, a variable he never anticipated found him. 9 hours. It was the longest 9 hours of Jackson Knight's life. The silence in this waiting room was so heavy, you could hear your own heartbeat, a rhythm set against the hum of the fluorescent lights and the whispered conversations of nurses in the hall. All his power, all his wealth, was now meaningless before the closed doors of that operating room. Then the doors swung open. The world-class surgeon stepped out, pulling off a sweat-soaked mask. His expression was unreadable. He looked directly at Jackson and said the words every person is terrified to hear. We ran into a complication. She was very close. How could a billionaire CEO, a man who had never shed a tear for anyone, be standing there shattered on the brink for a little girl he had only known for 3 months? What happened on that windswept sidewalk? And more importantly, who was that little girl? Join me as we turn back the clock, back to the moment it all began. A moment decided not by money, but by a hand-drawn comic book, an innocent question, and a pair of shoes without a single scuff. Let's go back 3 months. It was a typical Tuesday morning in Chicago, the kind of cutting cold that seeps through the thickest of coats. The sky was a leaden gray, promising an impending snowstorm. For Jackson Knight, the weather was nothing more than a data point. His world was controlled within the bulletproof glass of his luxury car and the walls of skyscrapers. He was on his way to Central Children's Hospital, but not as a philanthropist. He was attending as a board member of the investment group that owned it. The meeting's objective: approve a plan to cut operating costs by 20%, a cold decision made on Excel spreadsheets, a decision that would affect hundreds of lives he would never meet. He glanced at the Patek Philippe on his wrist. He was 3 minutes late. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Just as his driver opened the car door, a small figure appeared suddenly, almost from thin air, standing directly in his path. Jax's first reaction was irritation. A street vendor? Here? He moved to step around her, but the girl didn't flinch. She was about 8 years old, with large brown eyes that held an unusual determination far beyond her years. Her brown hair was in a neat braid, but a few strands had escaped, whipping around in the cold wind. And then she held it out. Not a candy bar or a cheap toy. It was a small booklet, its spine carefully stapled. The front cover was hand-drawn with crayons, the colors a bit messy, but the image was incredibly vivid. A little girl with blonde hair flying toward the sky, a pink cape trailing behind her. The handwritten title was clumsy but proud: The Adventures of Superhero Rosie. The little girl's voice rang out, clear and steady against the growl of city traffic. "Sir, please buy my comic. It's only $5. My sister is a real superhero, and she needs a new heart." To understand the weight of this moment, we need to understand the two worlds about to collide. Jackson Knight's world was a 90th floor penthouse where silence was a symbol of power. Minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking a miniature Chicago, a chessboard on which he was the only player. His success was measured in the zeros in his bank account and the fear in his rivals' eyes. Just an hour earlier, he'd ended a call with a ruthless command. "I don't care what their reasons are. If they don't meet the terms by end of day, kill the contract." To Jax, compassion was a luxury, a liability he had long since shed to climb to the top. But in another corner of the city, inside the very hospital Jax was walking toward, existed a completely different world. The world of Olivia, Lily, and Rosie's mother was one of endless hallways and the overwhelming smell of antiseptic. It was the steady beeping of machines and the muffled sobs of other parents. Her only power was the boundless love for her 2 daughters. Just 15 minutes ago, while waiting for Rosie's latest test results, she had received an email. The subject line was cold. Notice of contract termination. Her second job, cleaning offices at night, was gone. She stared at her phone screen, with its small crack in the corner, feeling as if the ground beneath her had just crumbled once more. Those 2 worlds, one of absolute power and one of utter helplessness, intersected on that cold sidewalk over a sentence about a superhero needing a new heart. Jax looked at the little girl, Lily, his analytical brain instantly kicking in. Was this a calculated ploy? A rehearsed story to get money? He narrowed his eyes, his voice taking on the cold tone he reserved for boardrooms. "There are hundreds of people on this street. Why did you pick me?" Lily didn't answer right away. She studied him, her gaze direct, without a trace of fear. Her eyes traveled from his emotionless face, down his expensive suit, and stopped on his perfectly polished Oxford shoes, which were without a single blemish. After a pause, she answered, her voice holding no plea, but something closer to a statement of fact. "Because your shoes are clean. My mom says you can see a person's burdens by the scuffs on their shoes. Your shoes, they don't have a single worry on them." And then, something strange happened. For the first time in years, Jackson Knight's brain stopped working. The silence in his head was louder than the silence in his penthouse. That sentence, it wasn't aimed at his wallet. It was aimed at something deeper, something he had long since forgotten. Not a single worry. The innocent words were like a needle piercing the perfect armor he had so painstakingly constructed. It wasn't an accusation. It was a naked truth. He stood there, on the freezing Chicago sidewalk, his leather briefcase still in hand containing plans to cut hospital costs, and for the first time, he felt the emptiness behind his own perfection. He looked into Lily's eyes and no longer saw a street vendor. He saw something else, something more real than the numbers on his balance sheets. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but for Jackson Knight, it felt like an eternity. The wall of ice he had spent years building around his heart had, for the first time, developed a crack. He no longer saw a boardroom meeting. He was no longer thinking about numbers or profits. He only saw the clear eyes of a little girl looking at him, not as a money-making machine, but as a person. And then, Jax did something he had never done in his entire career. He broke the plan. He pulled out his $1,000 phone, his finger flying across the screen. He wasn't calling his lawyer or his assistant. He composed a single brief text to his vice president. "Emergency. Cancel today's meeting." He didn't even wait for a response. He crouched down, for the first time truly meeting Lily's gaze, and his voice, no longer cold, held a strange certainty. "Okay, take me to your sister." Lily didn't hesitate. She gave a single solemn nod, as if this were the only possible outcome. She took Jax's large, warm hand in a gesture of absolute trust and pulled him through the hospital's revolving doors. For Jax, crossing that threshold was like entering another universe. His world was one of controlled silence and order. This was organized chaos. A PA system calling for doctors, the hurried rolling of gurney wheels, the sound of children crying, of adults whispering comfort. The smell of antiseptic and an invisible anxiety seemed to soak the very air. For the first time, he felt like an outsider, his expensive suit suddenly and awkwardly out of place. Lily led him to a small room at the end of the pediatric wing. Inside, a woman with tangled hair and dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep sat in a chair by the bed. That was Olivia. Seeing her daughter leading a strange man, she immediately stood up, her eyes filled with weariness and alarm. On the bed lay a smaller girl, her skin pale, her breathing shallow and weak. That was Rosie, the superhero from the comic book. Jax didn't need an explanation. He could see the battle they were fighting. He spoke with Olivia, and then with Rosie's attending physician. What he heard was worse than he could have imagined. Rosie's condition wasn't just a common heart defect. It was an extremely rare syndrome, a structural abnormality most surgeons had only ever read about in textbooks. This hospital, for all its prestige, lacked the specific expertise and equipment for such a complex operation. The only hope, the doctor said, was a leading specialist, a Swiss surgeon named Dr. Alistair Finch, who pioneered the field. But the cost of bringing him and his team here, along with the specialized equipment, was an astronomical figure. That night, Jax returned to his penthouse, but the usual powerful silence now felt empty. He looked out at the glittering city below, but his mind wasn't there. He was thinking of a little girl with a weak pulse and a brave older sister who sold her masterpiece for $5. At 3 a.m., as Chicago slept, Jax made a phone call. On the other end of the line, in Zurich, Dr. Finch answered groggily. Jax didn't waste time. He presented Rosie's case with the concise precision of a CEO closing a deal. When the doctor began to talk about protocols, scheduling, and costs, Jax cut him off. "Doctor," Jax said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "The cost is not an issue. The paperwork my team will handle. I'm not calling to ask if you can do it. I'm calling to ask when you can start. I need your brain and your hands, not your hesitation." The audacity worked. The doctor agreed to review the file immediately. In the following days, Jax Knight's world began to turn upside down. He still ran his company, but his focus had shifted. One afternoon, Frank, his loyal VP, called with an urgent tone. "Jax, the investors from Tokyo are on the line. This is the final call to close the merger. You can't miss this." Jax was at the hospital, sitting in a hard plastic chair, trying to read Rosie her own comic book. He glanced at Rosie, dozing lightly, then spoke into the phone, his voice surprisingly calm. "Frank, postpone it. Something more important has come up." He hung up, leaving Frank stunned. His something more important at that moment was going down to the hospital cafeteria to learn how to make hot chocolate. Lily had told him Rosie liked it extra sweet, with a marshmallow on top. Jax, the man who could move markets, fumbled awkwardly with the automated machine, spilling cocoa powder on the counter. When he brought the steaming cup back to the room and saw Rosie's weak but genuine smile as she took it, a real, if slightly crooked, smile appeared on his own lips. It was an unfamiliar feeling, a warmth that no million-dollar contract could ever provide. But his old world wouldn't let him go so easily. That evening, Frank called again. This time his voice wasn't just urgent. It held real concern. "Jax, I've tried to stall them, but rumors are spreading. The board is starting to ask questions. They want to know what your something more important is." Jax looked out the hospital window, where the first snowflakes of winter had begun to fall. He knew his battle wasn't just in an operating room. Another storm was brewing, right inside the empire he had built. Frank's warning was not an empty one. 2 days later, Jackson Knight was summoned to an emergency board meeting. He walked into the top-floor conference room where he had once been the undisputed king. But today, the atmosphere was different. 12 board members, 12 powerful gray suits, sat silently around the long wooden table. Their eyes were cold and probing. Frank, as Jax's longest-serving partner, began. His voice wasn't harsh, but steeped in disappointment. "Jax, we built this empire over 20 years. We built it on logic, on ruthless but necessary decisions, on always putting the company first. But for the past few weeks, you've been acting on emotion. You postponed a billion-dollar merger. You're using the company jet for unclear personal matters. You're making us a laughingstock in the market." Another member spoke, his voice sharp as a knife. "We hear you're channeling resources into a personal charity case. We admire your generosity, Jackson, but not when it compromises shareholder value. You have to choose." Jax listened in silence. He looked around the room, at the faces that had once conquered the world with him. He could see their concern, see the logic in their words. The old him, the man from 3 months ago, would have agreed with them completely. But that man was gone. He stood up, placed both hands on the table, and looked each one of them in the eye. "You're right," he began, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I have been acting on emotion. I did postpone a merger, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." He paused, letting his words sink into the room's silence. "For 20 years we've chased numbers, contracts, taller buildings. We succeeded. But for what? To sit in these sterile rooms and calculate what percentage of a children's hospital's budget to cut? To argue over stock values while there are lives out there being valued in paltry dollars?" He picked up a pen from the table. "You want me to choose? Fine, I've chosen. The Rosie Project, it's not a distraction. From now on, it is my new metric for success. This isn't charity. This is the most important work I've ever done." He put the pen down. "And if anyone in this room can't accept that, the door is right there." The absolute conviction in his voice extinguished all opposition. He was no longer a CEO making excuses. He was a leader declaring a new mission. A few days later, Olivia came to Jax's office to sign some necessary paperwork for the Swiss specialist. She walked into the penthouse completely overwhelmed. It was like a world from a movie, clean, minimalist, and cold. She felt small and out of place. While waiting for Jax to finish a call, she walked around the room, afraid to touch anything. And then she saw it. On the Wall of Honor, where the most prestigious awards and articles celebrating Jackson Knight as a business genius were displayed, there was something completely different. Placed reverently in an oak frame next to the Innovator of the Year award was the superhero Rosie comic book. The childish drawings and messy crayon colors were now gently illuminated, treated like a masterpiece. Olivia raised a hand to her mouth, tears flowing uncontrollably. They were no longer tears of sorrow or desperation. They were tears of understanding and boundless gratitude. She understood that this man's help didn't come from the pity of a rich man. It came from a place of genuine connection. He wasn't just saving her daughter, he was honoring their story. But just as hope was ignited, fate dealt a cruel blow. That afternoon, at the hospital, a week before the Swiss specialist was scheduled to arrive, Jax was sitting with Lily, watching her draw a new picture. Suddenly, from Rosie's room, the heart monitor began to emit a piercing, relentless series of alarms. Everything dissolved into chaos. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room. Olivia ran after them, her face white, Shouts of "Code Blue! Code Blue!" echoed down the hall. A terrified Lily clung to Jax's leg as he stood frozen. He looked through the glass pane of the door and saw Rosie's small body convulsing slightly as doctors performed CPR. Olivia collapsed in the hallway, her sobs drowned out by the pandemonium. The chief of surgery rushed out, grabbing Jax's arm. "Her heart can't hold on. We can't wait for next week. We have to perform a temporary bridging procedure right now to keep her alive, but it's incredibly risky. The success rate is very low." He looked directly into Jax's eyes. "We need the benefactor's consent. Now!" The world seemed to stop. The decision was now in Jax's hands. A life or death decision. He was no longer an investor calculating financial risk. He was a man holding a child's life in his hands. He looked at Olivia's tear-streaked face, down at the trembling little girl at his feet, and then into the hospital room, where his superhero was fighting her final battle. All hesitation vanished, replaced by a bone-chilling clarity. He looked the doctor straight in the eye, his voice firm, without a single tremor. "Do it!" Jackson's command, "Do it!" rang out, without a hint of hesitation, but each syllable was as heavy as lead. For him, it was the biggest gamble of his life, one where he wasn't betting with money, but with faith. The operating room doors swung shut, separating them from the world of life and death. The next few hours passed in a fog-like century. There was no longer a distinction between a CEO and a single mother. There were only 3 people huddled together on a cold bench in the hallway. Jax had taken off his expensive coat and draped it over Olivia's shivering shoulders. Lily, the brave little girl, had now fallen asleep in his lap, her small hand still clutching a crayon. Jax sat there, motionless as a statue, staring at a fixed point, praying for the first time in his life. He wasn't praying to any higher power. He was praying to the courage of a little girl he barely knew, a superhero fighting all alone in there. 4 hours later, the door opened. A doctor stepped out, sweat dotting his forehead, but his eyes no longer held panic. "We've stabilized her," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "The temporary procedure was a success. She's out of immediate danger. But the real fight is still ahead." Olivia broke down crying, this time in relief. Jax closed his eyes, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for 4 hours finally escaping. The little girl had more time. They had more hope. A week later, Dr. Alistair Finch, the top specialist from Switzerland, arrived. He was an older man with sharp eyes and an incredible sense of calm. After reviewing Rosie's condition, he met with Jax and Olivia. "The procedure last week," he said, "that's what saved her life. It gave us a small window to win. The main surgery will be long and complex, but we have to try." And then the fateful day arrived. Another waiting room, another tense silence. But this time, it was different. Woven into the anxiety was belief. Jax, Olivia, and Lily sat there, holding hands. They were no longer strangers connected by tragedy. They were a family, bonded by trial. 9 hours. 9 hours of hope and fear. Finally, Dr. Finch emerged, followed by the chief of surgery. The Swiss specialist smiled, a tired but radiant smile. "The little superhero's new heart has taken its first beats," he announced. "Perfectly." The silence shattered. Olivia collapsed to her knees, her unrestrained sobs echoing down the hall. Lily jumped up and down, laughing and crying, throwing her arms around her mother. And Jackson Knight, the man who built an empire of stone, simply turned to face the wall, pressing his forehead against the cool paint. He didn't sob, but the hot tears he had suppressed for so many years rolled silently down his cheeks. He wasn't crying from sorrow. He was crying from a sense of release, from a joy so immense his heart could barely contain it. 6 months passed. Chicago's harsh winter gave way to a brilliant summer. Gone were the cold hospital corridors, replaced by a sun-drenched park. Rosie, with rosy cheeks and shining blonde hair, was wobbling on a small pink bicycle. She fell, picked herself up, dusted off her knees, and giggled. "I almost got it," she yelled. In the distance, on a blanket spread on the grass, Lily was diligently drawing. She was finishing the last pages of Volume 2. Superhero Rosie Conquers the World. Jax and Olivia sat on a nearby bench, watching it all in silence. A comfortable peace settled over them. Olivia turned to him, smiling. "Thank you, Jax, for everything." Jax looked at her, then at the two laughing children. He shook his head. "No, Olivia, I should be thanking you. You all saved me." And it was the truth. He didn't just adopt the two girls and become part of their family. He had found himself again. A few months later, he stood on the stage of a charity gala. Behind him was the logo of a new organization, the Neidhart Foundation. He had used the entire profit from that billion-dollar merger to establish the fund, sponsoring complex heart surgeries for underprivileged children across the country. His actions didn't just save one life, they created a butterfly effect, bringing hope to thousands more. This story isn't just about money or kindness. It's about the power of an interruption. Our lives are planned to the minute, by the meeting, by the goal. We rush past people, past stories, with a singular focus on our own finish line. The lesson Jackson Knight learned on that cold sidewalk, the lesson we can all carry with us, is this. Don't be afraid to have your life interrupted. Dare to stop when a small voice, an unexpected story, or a hand-drawn comic book asks for your attention. Because the most important moments, the people who will redefine who you are, the turning points that will give your life true meaning, are never on the schedule. Sometimes, to find yourself, you have to be willing to get lost for someone else. People often say the greatest battles shape who we are. For Jackson Knight, that was true, but only halfway. The battle for Rosie's life had saved his soul. But it was the small, quiet battles fought every day afterward that truly healed and built the new man he had become. A father. A year after the surgery, on a humid Thursday afternoon, Jackson Knight found himself sitting on a green plastic chair, the kind that was far too small for his frame. He was in a 4th grade classroom, surrounded by crudely drawn pictures taped to the walls and the distinct smell of crayons and glue. He was attending his first ever parent-teacher conference. The old him, the CEO from 3 years ago, would have sent an assistant for this. But the Jacks of today considered this the most important meeting of the quarter. Lily's teacher, a young woman with a kind smile, told him that Lily was a bright girl with a soaring imagination and was fiercely protective of her sister. "She always makes sure Rosie gets the best cookie at snack time," the teacher smiled. Next, he met Rosie's teacher. "Rosie is our class's little miracle," she said, her eyes twinkling. "She has a boundless energy. She runs and jumps and laughs more than any other child, as if she's making up for lost time." Jax just nodded, a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling of satisfaction more valuable than any financial report with triple-digit growth. This was his return on investment. Not numbers on a page, but the sound of a child's laughter and the security in another's eyes. On the way home, Lily asked him, "How was the meeting, Dad?" Jax looked at his 2 daughters in the rearview mirror and smiled. "The teacher said I have the 2 most wonderful daughters in the world." Lily giggled, while Rosie puffed out her chest with pride. That evening unfolded like any other in their cozy home. They had dinner together at the kitchen table, where stories from school and work mingled. Jax's work was no longer about cold takeover negotiations. His work was now meetings with the board of the Neidhart Foundation, reviewing the files of children in need, finding new Dr. Finches, and ensuring that no parent would have to endure the desperation Olivia once had. After dinner, it was time for homework. Jax, the man who could analyze the most complex economic models, found himself scratching his head over Lily's fourth-grade word problem. If a train leaves Chicago for New York at a speed of X, he sighed, feigning helplessness. Dad, you built an empire, but you can't solve this, Lily teased. My empire didn't have trains this complicated, he replied, and the three of them burst out laughing. Olivia leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with a contented smile. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, a simple peace she once thought she'd never have. After helping Lily with the tricky problem, the family gathered around the coffee table where a stack of drawing paper and colored pencils were waiting. They were working on a special project, Volume 3 of Superhero Rosie. This time the story wasn't about a fight in a hospital. It was about the adventures of Rosie and Lily rescuing lost animals in a magical forest with the help of a big, kind knight, a character drawn to look like Jax. The comic book, once a symbol of desperate sacrifice, had now become a living legacy, a joyful family tradition. Later that night, after Lily was fast asleep, Jax went into Rosie's room to tuck her in. He pulled the blanket up to her chin and placed a kiss on her forehead. As he was about to leave, a small hand stopped him. "Daddy?" Rosie whispered, her clear eyes looking at him in the dim glow of the nightlight. "What is it, my superhero?" She hesitated for a moment, then asked a question with all the innocence of a 6-year-old, a question that pierced right through Jax's heart. "Before you found us, were you lonely?" Jax froze. No one had ever asked him that. He had never dared to ask himself that. He looked into Rosie's eyes, the eyes that had been saved, the eyes that had saved him. He couldn't lie. He sat down on the edge of the bed, taking her small hand in his. He took a deep breath and admitted a truth he himself had only recently come to realize. "Yes," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was very lonely, Rosie. I didn't know it back then." Rosie smiled, a look of peaceful understanding, then slowly closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Jax sat there for a long time, in the quiet of the room. He realized his journey wasn't over. Every day, in ordinary moments like this, a parent-teacher conference, a difficult math problem, a question before bedtime, he was still being healed. He hadn't just given a family, he had gained one. And in that simple, beautiful rhythm, he had finally, truly found his way home.